50,000 Italian soldiers arrived in the United States as prisoners of war between 1942 and 1944, men captured in the desert campaigns of North Africa who had been transported across the Atlantic in the same ships bringing American soldiers to the fight. They arrived expecting what prisoners of war expected in the middle of a world war: deprivation, suspicion, confinement, and the slow misery of waiting for a conflict they had not chosen to grind itself to an end. What they found instead was something that none of them had words for at the time, and that many of them spent the rest of their lives struggling to adequately describe. They found ordinary American life, and ordinary American life was so different from anything their experience had prepared them for that it changed them in ways they could not undo. When the war ended and the ships came to take them home, thousands of them did not want to go. That number is not metaphorical, and it is not an exaggeration assembled from a handful of exceptional cases. The War Department's own records document formal petitions from Italian prisoners requesting transfer to immigrant or resident alien status rather than repatriation. American employers and community members submitted affidavits and petitions on their behalf. Members of Congress received letters from constituents in farming states arguing that their Italian labor was essential and that the men had earned the right to stay. The State Department conducted internal debates about what to do with prisoners who had, by every available measure, become attached to America in a way that complicated the straightforward administrative process of sending them home. None of this made the newspapers at the time because the War Department preferred to keep the POW program out of public discussion, but all of it is in the archives. The story of the Italian prisoners in America is one of the most human stories the Second World War produced, and almost nobody knows it. To understand how it happened, you need to start with a number that sets everything else in context. The United States held approximately 425,000 Italian prisoners of war during the course of the war. These men were housed in over 150 camps across 38 states. They worked on farms and in food processing plants and in military installations and in forestry and in construction. The escape rate among Italian prisoners was the lowest of any POW nationality held by any major power during the entire war. In a population of 425,000 men, the number of escape attempts that resulted in prisoners remaining at large for more than 24 hours can be counted in dozens, not hundreds, dozens. The Italian prisoners were not just not escaping. They were, in the assessment of the War Department officers who managed them, the most cooperative prisoner population in the history of American military administration. The story begins in the North African desert in the spring and summer of 1943, when the Axis forces in Tunisia collapsed and approximately 250,000 German and Italian soldiers surrendered to Allied forces in the largest mass surrender of the war up to that point. The Italian soldiers who were among those captured came overwhelmingly from a specific demographic. They were conscripts, young men from the farms and small towns of central and southern Italy who had been called up for a war that their government had entered in June 1940 with a level of genuine popular enthusiasm that had not survived contact with the reality of fighting beside the German army in conditions for which Italian forces were consistently undersupplied and inadequately equipped. By the time they surrendered in Tunisia, a significant proportion of the Italian prisoners were not sorry to be out of the war. They were sorry about the specific circumstances of how they came to be out of it, but not about the outcome. American processing officers noticed this almost immediately. The German prisoners required a different management approach. They were organized, resistant to interrogation, often ideologically committed, and their camp populations contained both sincere Nazis and men who had decided that performing Nazi commitment was the safest way to get through captivity. The Italians were different. They were not organized in any political sense. They were not ideologically committed to a cause that could be used to maintain group cohesion against American authority. They were, in the assessment of multiple camp commanders whose reports survive in the National Archives, simply men who were very far from home and who responded to decent treatment with a warmth and an energy that the camp administrators had not anticipated and did not quite know what to do with. The Geneva Convention required that prisoners of war be housed and fed at a standard equivalent to that of the detaining power's own troops. The United States followed this requirement. Italian prisoners received the same food rations as American soldiers. They had access to recreational facilities, libraries, and religious services. Camp construction was adequate, and in many cases better than what the prisoners had been living with in the North African campaign. The first Italian prisoners to arrive at American camps wrote letters home that their families in Italy initially did not believe because the letters described conditions that sounded like peacetime accommodations rather than wartime captivity. The food alone was, for men from the rural south of Italy, a revelation. The labor program changed everything. The War Department faced a problem in 1943 that it had not fully anticipated when the North African campaign ended. American agriculture was in a labor shortage that threatened the food production needed to feed both the domestic population and the Allied forces overseas. The men who had worked the farms were in uniform. The harvest was coming, and there was nobody to bring it in. Italian prisoners, sitting in camps and consuming resources and producing nothing, were an obvious solution to a problem that had no other obvious solution. The War Department developed a labor program that assigned Italian prisoners to farms across the country, primarily in the South, the Midwest, and the West, where the labor shortage was most acute. What happened when Italian prisoners went to work on American farms was not what the War Department had planned for, because the War Department had planned for a labor program, and what actually developed was something more complex and more human than any program could contain. The prisoners worked alongside American families. They ate at American tables. They learned English from American children, and they taught Italian to American farmers and their wives who were curious about the men who had arrived to help save the harvest. They fixed equipment and built fences and did the 100 other things that needed doing on a working farm, and they did them with a competence and a willingness that made the families who employed them feel something that was difficult to name in the middle of a war: gratitude toward men who were technically enemies. The regulations governing Italian prisoner labor were explicit about maintaining appropriate separation between prisoners and civilian populations. The regulations were regularly not followed because the families employing Italian labor found the regulations impractical, and because the prisoners themselves pushed gently but consistently against the boundaries of what was permitted. Sunday church attendance became a particular point of contact. Italian prisoners were Catholic, and American rural communities were Catholic, and the local parish became a place where the categories of prisoner and civilian softened in ways that the regulations had not anticipated. Priests who had learned Italian or who spoke it already became intermediaries between the prisoners and the communities, and what began as a religious accommodation became something more like genuine social integration. Italy surrendered to the Allies on September 8, 1943, and the surrender created a legal and administrative crisis that the War Department had not prepared for. The 425,000 Italian men being held in American camps were technically prisoners of a country that was no longer at war with the United States and was, within weeks, actively co-belligerent against Germany. They were enemy prisoners who had become something that the laws governing prisoners of war had no precise category for. The State Department and the War Department spent several months arguing about what to do with them, and the solution they arrived at was one of the most unusual administrative decisions of the entire American war effort. The Italian Service Unit program, created in the spring of 1944, offered Italian prisoners the option of signing a statement acknowledging that Italy and the United States were no longer at war and agreeing to perform labor voluntarily in support of the Allied war effort. Men who signed were reclassified from prisoners of war to Italian Service Unit members. They were issued American uniforms with ISU patches. They were paid at a rate approaching American military pay rather than the nominal prisoner pay rate. They retained their POW legal status in some technical senses, but in practical terms, they were functioning as quasi-military laborers with significantly greater freedom of movement and significantly better conditions than their prisoner status had provided. The program was voluntary. Approximately 34,000 Italian prisoners enrolled. The men who did not enroll were not punished, but the contrast between the two groups within the camps became a source of social pressure that shaped the experience of the entire Italian prisoner population. The ISU members were visible evidence of a path that was available, and their better conditions and greater freedom were a daily advertisement for what cooperation with the American system could provide. The camp administrators understood this dynamic and used it deliberately, placing ISU and non-ISU populations in adjacent facilities where the differences were apparent. It was a form of institutional persuasion, and it worked in the direction the War Department intended, but it also produced something the War Department had not specifically designed for. It accelerated the development of genuine attachment to American life among a population that was already more receptive to it than any enemy prisoner population the United States had ever managed. By 1944, the Italian prisoner population in America had developed characteristics that made it unique in the history of wartime captivity. The men had been in America long enough to learn the language at a functional level. They had formed relationships with American families that went beyond the transactional. They had, in many cases, established romantic attachments to American women, which the regulations prohibited and which happened anyway with a frequency that the camp commanders documented in their reports, with the weary acknowledgement of administrators who understood that some regulations are more enforceable than others. Italian prisoners were writing letters home describing America in terms that made their families worry that the men were losing their Italian identity, and some of them were, in the sense that identity is partly constituted by the world you inhabit, and the Italian prisoners were inhabiting America. The American communities that had absorbed Italian prisoner labor were simultaneously developing an investment in the men that made the eventual repatriation process more complicated than a simple administrative transfer. Farmers who had worked alongside Italian prisoners for 2 or 3 seasons had opinions about those men that were not easily reconciled with the category of enemy prisoner. Church communities that had integrated Italian prisoners into their social life had formed bonds that the concept of temporary captivity did not adequately describe. American women who had formed romantic relationships with Italian prisoners faced a personal crisis when repatriation approached that was real and human and documented in letters and petitions that survive in state archives and in the War Department files. The war had created a situation, through the specific mechanism of the labor program, in which the category of enemy had been dissolved by the chemistry of proximity and shared work and ordinary human contact. The most dramatic evidence of this transformation was the escape rate, or rather the near-complete absence of one. Prisoners of war escape. It is what prisoners of war do, or attempt to do, in every recorded history of captivity. German prisoners in America escaped regularly enough that the FBI maintained a standing task force to locate them. Japanese prisoners escaped less frequently, but with more violence when they did. Italian prisoners in America did not escape, or did so rarely enough that the statistical record looks like an error. Camp commanders who noted this in their reports offered explanations that ranged from the institutional to the personal. But the most consistent explanation in the records is also the simplest. The Italian prisoners did not escape because they did not want to leave. The repatriation process began in late 1945 and extended through most of 1946, and it produced a crisis that the War Department had not anticipated, even though the signs had been accumulating for 2 years. The formal petitions from Italian prisoners requesting to remain in the United States arrived in numbers that overwhelmed the administrative process designed to handle exceptional cases. The petitions were not form letters. They were personal documents written in the careful English that men had taught themselves over 3 years of American captivity, explaining specific situations and specific attachments and specific reasons why the category of prisoner did not capture what the man filing the petition had become during his time in America. Many of the petitions cited women. Italian prisoners had formed relationships with American women at a rate that the regulations had been unable to prevent, and the prospect of repatriation meant the prospect of permanent separation from women some of them had promised to marry. The War Department received affidavits from American women describing relationships that had been conducted under the constraints of prisoner status and that were intended by both parties to become marriages as soon as the legal situation permitted. The State Department received inquiries from members of Congress whose constituents were in this situation and who wanted to know whether the immigration laws could accommodate men who had been in the country for 3 years on prisoner status and who had American sponsors willing to guarantee their support. If stories like these men's matter to you, if what ordinary decency can do across the lines of war matters, if the America that strangers found when they needed it most matters, subscribe to the Foxhole Chronicles. We tell forgotten stories every week, stories that deserve remembering, heroes that deserve honoring. The Italian prisoner's story is one among many more coming. Subscribe and stay with us. Keep these memories alive together. The petitions were largely denied. This is the part of the story that the comfortable narrative of American generosity does not accommodate, and it deserves to be told straight. The War Department and the State Department made a determination that the Italian prisoners were prisoners of war, that the armistice and subsequent co-belligerent status did not change their fundamental legal category as foreign nationals who had been admitted to the United States under the laws of war rather than the laws of immigration, and that allowing them to remain would create precedents that immigration law was not prepared to handle. The petitions were processed and the denials were issued, and the ships came to the docks and the men boarded them. Most of them, not all. Some Italian prisoners who had formed marriages with American women before repatriation, through the legal mechanism of prisoner marriages that the regulations permitted in limited circumstances, were able to return to the United States as the spouses of American citizens through the War Brides Act of 1945. Some prisoners who had identified American relatives, often the children or grandchildren of Italian immigrants, were able to establish qualifying connections for immigration preference. Some simply waited. They went back to Italy, reconnected with families they had not seen in 3 or 4 years, and then applied through normal immigration channels to return to the country where they had spent their captivity. Some of them made it back. Some did not. The Italian-American community in the United States played a role in this story that the historical record documents, but that the popular memory of the period has largely forgotten. There were approximately 5 million Italian-Americans in the United States in 1942, a significant proportion of them first or second generation, with family connections to the regions of Italy from which the prisoner population was predominantly drawn. The War Department made a deliberate decision to leverage these connections by assigning Italian prisoners, where possible, to camps in areas with significant Italian-American populations. The logic was administrative. Italian-American intermediaries could help with translation, could smooth the management of the prisoner population, and could reduce the friction that came from men who spoke no English being managed by officers who spoke no Italian. What the War Department did not fully anticipate was the emotional dimension of these encounters. Italian-American families whose fathers or uncles or cousins had come to America in the decades before the war, who had built their lives in America and raised American children, were suddenly in contact with men from the same villages, sometimes the same families, who had stayed in Italy and ended up in the war on the other side. The meetings were sometimes awkward and sometimes painful and sometimes joyful in a way that collapsed the categories of war entirely. Italian-American men who were serving in the American Army, fighting in Italy against the forces that had captured their prisoner cousins, received letters from their parents describing Sunday dinners with Italian prisoners who remembered the same streets and the same church bells and the same feast days. The war was doing strange things to family, and the prisoner program was one of the places where those strange things were most visible. The men who were repatriated in 1945 and 1946 returned to an Italy that had been physically and psychologically devastated by the last 2 years of the war. The Italian campaign had been one of the most brutal of the European theater, fought up the length of the peninsula in grinding attritional battles that left towns and ancient cities in rubble. The Italian economy was in collapse. The political situation was chaotic, with the Christian Democrats and the Communist Party competing for control of a country that was trying to rebuild its institutions from the wreckage of fascism. The men who came back from American camps returned to all of this carrying memories of a country where farms were productive and people were fed and the machinery worked and the churches were intact and the families were whole. Many of them wrote about the contrast. The letters and memoirs that survive from the repatriated Italian prisoners are among the most poignant documents the war produced, because they are the records of men trying to reconcile two realities that could not be made to fit together comfortably. The Italy they had come back to was their country, their language, their families, the landscape they had grown up in. The America they had left was a place where they had arrived as enemies and where something had happened to them that they could not fully name. One prisoner, writing from his village in Calabria in 1947, described the experience of returning as walking back into a photograph while carrying a memory of color. The photograph was real. The color was also real. He could not explain why he felt as if the photograph were the thing that needed explaining. The ones who came back to America came back through the ordinary channels of post-war immigration, the quota systems and the preference categories, and the sponsorship requirements that governed who could enter the country and when. Some of them married the American women they had met during their captivity and returned as husbands of American citizens. Some of them had maintained connections with American families who sponsored their immigration applications. Some of them simply waited for the quota system to admit them, sometimes for years, corresponding with the American families they had worked for and the communities they had been part of, maintaining the connection across the Atlantic by letter until the legal mechanism caught up with the human reality. The ones who could not come back did not stop thinking about America. This is documented not in official records, but in the oral histories that Italian historians collected from the surviving prisoners in the 1970s and 1980s, when the men were in their 60s and 70s and willing to talk about experiences they had spent decades processing in private. The consistent element in these testimonies is not bitterness about the denial of their petitions to stay. It is something more like a sustained awareness of a road not taken, a life not lived, a country that had briefly been theirs and then had been taken back by the machinery of international law and post-war administration. One man, interviewed in 1979 in his home in Palermo, was asked what he remembered most clearly about his time in America. He said he remembered the silence of a Kansas evening, the way the fields went quiet after the work was done, and the sky went colors that he had never seen anywhere else. He had tried to describe those colors to his children. He had not been able to. The American farmers who had employed them did not forget either. The oral histories collected by American historians in the farming states where Italian prisoner labor had been concentrated contain testimony that mirrors the Italian accounts in its emotional register. Farmers who had worked beside Italian prisoners for 2 or 3 harvests described relationships that were not reducible to the employer-employee dynamic or the captor-prisoner dynamic. They described men. They described specific men with specific qualities and specific skills and specific ways of laughing, men who had come to their farms as prisoners and had left as something that the English language did not have a precise word for. Not friends exactly, because the power relationship had been too asymmetrical for that word to fit without qualification. Not employees, not enemies, men who had worked beside them for a season of their lives and who had then gone away and left a specific kind of absence. The Italian prisoner story is forgotten not because it was hidden, but because it does not fit the categories that war stories are usually told in. It is not a story of heroism in the conventional sense. It is not a story of suffering. It is not a story of victory or defeat. It is a story about what happens when ordinary human beings are placed in proximity with each other across the lines of a war and given the time and the conditions to become something to each other that the war had not intended for them to become. The Italian prisoners arrived in America as enemies. They left as something that had no name in the laws of nations or the protocols of military administration. What they had become was visible to everyone involved and was perfectly legible in human terms. It just had no official category. It still does not. The best word for it, the one that comes closest, is neighbors. They had become neighbors, and then the war ended, and being neighbors was no longer permitted, and most of them went home, but not without asking first if they could stay.